Good morning. I'm told that the echo is really important, so good morning. I'm Hetty Weinberg. I'm the director of the ACLU of Tennessee. Before we start, I'd love our staff, our fantastic staff, to just kind of raise a hand. They're all wearing blue ribbons, and I invite you after the program to stop and talk with them, ask questions, tell them what you're thinking, because we're all in this together. So the more you know about us, the more we know about you, the more we can make change in this city, state, and country. As many of you know and probably expect, ACLU has been leading the resistance with hundreds of thousands of people on the ground against the Trump administration's really constant assault on civil liberties and civil rights. We have, since the president was elected, brought over 242 legal actions against the Trump administration, halting, as you'll hear later, the separation of migrant families, overturning the president's ban on transgenders being in the military, fighting for access to reproductive health care for women, protecting religious freedom. The list goes on and on. And as far as I know, ACLU was actually the only civil rights, civil liberties organization prior to the election that actually thought about what might happen if Trump was elected. Some folks, even within our own organization, asked, why are you doing that? It's not gonna happen. But I will tell you, on November 9th, people were very glad that ACLU had a roadmap into what this man was thinking, and said, as we continue to say, we will see you in court if you in any way pursue the outrageous, the illegal, the hateful policies that he was promoting on the campaign trail. And as you know, indeed, we have continued to see him in court. So before we start, or before we get to hear our speaker today, we're going to show you a video. It's a video that was shown couple weeks ago at the ACLU Biennial Leadership Conference, and it really will give you a sense of ACLU's very powerful precedent-setting work. Then it's about 6 minutes. I'll return to introduce the person we're all waiting to hear from. Lee will speak for about 35, 40 minutes. We'll take some questions, and we should conclude about 12:30. So now we will see the video, which should show right up there. So we've been busy, we've all been busy, and you can see that these unprecedented attacks on our fundamental freedoms are having really a brutal impact on people's lives. So ACLU, as you know and as you've seen, is front and center, working really, I can tell you, and Lee can tell you, around the clock to mitigate or to halt the government's most really heartless and egregious practices. Our speaker today is on the front lines. Lee Gelernt has been fighting for democracy for, as he said, over 25 years, and this is the worst he's ever seen it. And he continues to challenge the ongoing assault on immigrants and refugees and the administration's attack on the most vulnerable of all of us. Lee is the deputy director of the ACLU's National Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project and is a close colleague of the affiliates across the country, working with us when we're dealing with similar issues in our state, where there are attacks on immigrants and refugees. And many of you know that's been constant with our Tennessee General Assembly and even in some of our cities. Lee, in his role, he is used to taking on controversial causes, and he continues to pursue the groundbreaking challenges to the Trump administration's policies. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about him. I could go for hours, but Lee successfully, as many of you probably first saw 3 years ago, argued the first case challenging the president's travel ban, the Muslim travel ban on individuals from certain Muslim majority nations, which, as you know, resulted in the federal court issuing a nationwide injunction late on a Saturday night against the ban, just 1 day after the president had enacted it, had signed the executive order, and actually just 8 days after his inauguration. Lee successfully argued in the Ninth Circuit on behalf of a Mexican family concerning the fatal cross-border shooting of their teenage family member in Mexico by a U.S. Border Patrol officer firing from U.S. soil when this young man was in in Mexico. He recently argued a major case in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on behalf of cities and counties challenging Texas's anti-sanctuary SB4 immigration law. And today, as you will hear more about, he is the lead attorney fighting to stop the separation of children from their parents at the border, kids who are being ripped away from their parents. No knowledge, in fact, we know that where these kids are today. He is currently litigating a national class action involving the Trump administration's practice of separating immigrant families at the border. And on June 26, a federal court in San Diego issued an injunction holding the practice unconstitutional and requiring the administration to reunite the approximately 2,600 families who'd been separated. And this case continues, and it's so important to hear from Lee about what's really happening. Just some basic background, and nothing's ever basic with Lee. He grew up in Manhattan. He graduated from Tufts. He received a master's degree from the London School of Economics, and he received his law degree from Columbia Law School, where he was a notes and comments editor of the Law Review. After graduation, he served as a law clerk to the late Judge Frank Coffin of the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. So Lee, many of you have probably seen Lee on TV, on MSNBC, on CNN. He's clearly been quoted on the New York Times, the Washington Post. Sometimes his voice hits the newspapers here. Let me conclude by just saying Lee's a rock star. And that's a real high bar because people at ACLU are all very cool, but he stands out as a rock star. He's a brilliant lawyer, and to me, most importantly, he's a compassionate human being. So I welcome you, and I'm very delighted that you have come to join us in Nashville. Thank you.
So I feel like maybe now I need to put my shades on now just to live up to that. Well, thank you, Hetty. It's really nice to be here. I just want to say a couple of words about the ACLU structure and the Tennessee affiliate here. I've always felt, and I think particularly now, that one of the great strengths, maybe the greatest strength of the ACLU, is that we have a national office where people can specialize in particular issues, but then each state has its own affiliate that is on the ground, knows what's going on in that state, knows the people, knows really what's going on, and can always be there to partner with the national office, or we partner with them. And I would just say that, Hetty I'm not sure there's anybody at the ACLU who's really been fighting this fight longer or harder than she has, and the affiliate she's built here has really been an unbelievable asset to us doing immigrants' rights and the ACLU generally. Yeah, absolutely. So I think you all, I would never say that any ACLU affiliate is not great, but since this is off the record, I think this affiliate is really second to none in being courageous and taking on the fights that need to be taken on. So I think you all are very lucky to have this affiliate here. What I thought, I'm hoping we could sort of have just a conversation, and I will try not to talk too long, and maybe Hetty can give me a signal when I'm should be wrapping up, so that we can, because I really would like to hear from you all what you all are seeing. I think it's important for you all to be able to express what you are seeing and feeling, but it's also helpful for me. We at the National Office obviously have a general sense of where the country is and how things break down in different regions, but you all have a much better sense of it, and it's critical, I think, for us if we are going to push back on a public relations level, in court, the legislatures, and Congress, to have a much more nuanced understanding of what people are feeling in each state. So I definitely want to leave some time for us to just have a conversation. What I thought I would do is maybe talk about two cases in particular. One is the case we have in San Diego, the national class action, which Hetty mentioned, involving the separation of little children. And I also want to talk very briefly about the Muslim ban challenge, which now seems like a lifetime ago, but yet it is only 3 years ago. Every week actually seems like a lifetime now with this administration. And so let me talk about those two. Then I want to just give you a very brief overview of everything else that we're challenging. I mean, I will not be able to hit everything else because there's so much, but just some of the highlights, and then we can open it up to questions. I want to start, I guess, with the Muslim ban because I want to talk about a theme that Hetty mentioned about the courts being there. You know, I think there's a perception that if we don't win every case or we have setbacks, then the courts aren't really there for us. I think that's probably wrong. We've never won every case. We never will win every case, and it'll become harder. But we have won an awful lot of cases, far more than we've lost in the last 3 years. And I think as importantly, the courts, when we haven't lost, have pushed back and forced the administration to narrow various policies. And sometimes I think the role of the courts in the United States gets taken for granted. You know, so I just want to sort of start maybe with a little behind the scenes of the Muslim ban. As Hetty said, we had prepared for a Trump administration. Now, to be honest with everyone in the room, our briefing book on what we would do if Hillary were elected was this high, and our briefing book for Trump was, you know, because we, like everyone else, assumed that it would be Hillary. But we had prepared, and we had started researching all the issues that he had raised during the campaign. When he was then elected, we knew that we had to start getting ready. And so what he had been talking about on a significant basis, almost every day, was the Muslim ban, and continued to talk about it before he was inaugurated. So we began getting ready to challenge that and put together a team with other groups out there. And the day he was inaugurated, he talked about it again, and that whole week after he was inaugurated, drafts started leaking of the Muslim ban. So we were really getting prepared. And on Friday, exactly 1 week after he was inaugurated, at 5 o'clock, they released the Muslim ban. But we actually did not think it was going to need to be challenged immediately, that it would go into effect immediately. So we had a call with the other groups to strategize from 7 to 9:30 that night on Friday night. And we all felt like, you know, we're going to need to do this within a couple of weeks, but it's not going to be necessary to do it immediately. When we got off the phone, we started getting texts that people who had arrived at JFK that night, including 2 people who had worked with our U.S. military in Iraq, who had been given visas, who had been vetted, who had gotten on the plane thinking they would be allowed to come to the United States after all this time to get out of danger, because ISIS obviously knew that they were with the United States military, assisting our U.S. military. He signed the ban while they were on the plane. They got off the plane and they said, no, you're not going to be allowed in. We stayed up all night and filed a complaint the next morning at 6 in the morning. What we said was, look, we think this is unconstitutional and we want an immediate hearing. But we realized that during the night, many people were in the same situation as these 2 men who had arrived at JFK, and they were all over the country. And what we needed was to keep them in the country till the court could hear the case, hopefully Monday, but if not, shortly after Monday. We decided, well, we better get a stay of removal, meaning they have to be kept in the U.S. and can't be sent back till the court can hear the case. We tried to reach out to someone in the government. No one had any idea who to reach out to in the new administration. So we tried the local U.S. attorney in New York. They said, you know, this caught us off guard. We have no idea. So we began preparing what's called stay of removal papers, meaning asking the court, please keep these individuals in the U.S., don't let them be sent back to harm until you can rule on this case. And so during the day, and so we started this about noon after we could not reach anybody. During the day, I sort of out of the corner of my eye was watching the TV and seeing every news channel, cable and network, covering the airports, that people were rushing to the airports to help. But I'm not sure I fully grasped how big a deal it was at that time. I think partly just from being tired and partly because I was absorbed in writing these stay papers. We filed the stay papers at 5:30, and the emergency judge said, I want you all down here at 8 o'clock at night. This is a Saturday night, so highly unusual. And so I said, okay, I got to shower and shave and I told my wife and kids I should be back fairly soon. I don't think this is going to be a big deal. Right. And I went down there, and there were 40 people outside the Brooklyn courthouse. And I said, wow, this is remarkable. People out here supporting us, probably 40 people on a Saturday night. By the time we got upstairs, the courtroom was filled, about a third press, about a third people from the community, and about a third various lawyers. And the judge said, this is a very public hearing, it's important, everyone's allowed in the courtroom, we're going to use every bit of space in the courtroom. And the government lawyers, I think, were taken by surprise by all this. So they got a lawyer from Washington, from the Department of Justice, on the phone. She didn't have time to get here, and the local U.S. attorney people were at the counsel table. And the judge started with two very pointed questions. And she said to the lawyer on the phone, first, can you tell me whether these individuals will be harmed if they're sent back this weekend before I've had a chance to rule on the merits of the case? And the lawyer, to her credit, said, Your Honor, I cannot give you any assurance that they'll be safe if sent back. The judge said, okay. Then the judge said to her, I have one more question. Can you tell me, given that these individuals have been vetted and have worked, many of them of whom have worked with our U.S. military, will be a danger to the United States if I let them remain in the United States this week until I can rule on the case? And the lawyer said, the president thinks they're a danger, which was an interesting way to deal with the question. The judge said, okay. Then she turned to me and said, what do you need? And I said, we need an immediate order. I know it's Saturday night. We need an immediate order from you, and we need you to instruct the government to get the word out to every airport and every official. She said, okay, I'm trying to grasp exactly how immediate this needs to be. And at that point, a lawyer who was sitting in the back came rushing up to me, which is, for all of you who are lawyers know that that's highly unusual for someone to come up there. And he handed me a note that said, and it was like one of those TV movies. I mean, I'm not used to that kind of courtrooms. I said, Your Honor, I've just been handed a note, But the note actually said his client was on the plane and they were getting ready to send her back to the Middle East in 30 minutes. So I said, Your Honor, I've just been handed a note. She said, well, I can see that we're really down to the minute here. And then she said, I'm going to stay the removal of all these people. And the people in the audience broke out clapping, which again, was like my cousin Vinny, for any of you who have seen, and that's not something I'm used to in these sort of, I feel like I litigate a lot of high profile cases, but they're very staid and formal and no one breaks out and claps. And so it was one of those moments. And we walked out of the courtroom. By now it's, 9:30, and we walked out of the courtroom, and the courtroom was soundproof. So I expected maybe a few stragglers from the 40 to still be there. And we walked out, and there were about 2,000 people and all the TV cameras. And there was a very junior lawyer with me who had started about 2 months ago. And I said to him, this is always the way it is when we do cases. We walked out, and there's 2,000 people waiting for us. And it really was that kind of TV movie thing where MSNBC said, we're live with, tell us what happened, boom. And people were cheering, and it was, an unbelievably emotional moment. I think there were a lot of people in the audience who were specifically there because the Muslim ban felt like such an affront to them. But I think there were other people who felt, were not there necessarily specifically as the Muslim, but were feeling like is our democracy in trouble with this new president? Is the rule of law in trouble? And for us, this was the first case, right, because we're only 8 days from his inauguration, the first case dealing with one of his civil liberties problems. And I think people's emotion just poured out. And, you know, a lot can be taken from what happened that night. I mean, ultimately, as you all know, the Supreme Court let them do the Muslim ban, but not before we had gotten it significantly narrowed. By the time they were allowed to do it, they were on their third iteration of the Muslim ban, and it became significantly narrowed from what we challenged initially. But one of the things that I take from it is a point that Hetty made about the role of the courts, and what I tell my law students when I'm teaching and other people is, you know, we take for granted that this single federal judge could stop the President of the United States from doing something in an area of national security, right? I mean, that, especially for immigrants who come from countries where that would be unheard of, that you could tell the president of that country, you may not do something that you're claiming is in our country's national interest and national security interest. And I think sometimes it gets lost how unbelievable our system is. I mean, a lot of people quibble with the judge's ruling and said, well, she should have given the government more time to submit additional papers or this or that, or she should have, you know, waited a day. But those are all sort of secondary quibbles. No one really, you know, maybe our president, but no one really on either side questioned that a federal judge had the power to stop this. And it's really a remarkable thing. And I think it's important that people not forget the structural role our courts play and how important it is. We are not going to win every case, and we cannot do it alone in the courts. Public outcry is the most critical to ensuring the rule of law and democracy. But the courts have played an enormous role over the last 3 years. And so I feel like that's one of the things, maybe the main thing I took from that night in Brooklyn. And it's, you know, it's a point that Hetty stresses all the time, and that I think we all ought to keep in mind about how lucky we are to have the courts. I mean, at times it feels like the courts are not doing enough, that they're letting us down. But nonetheless, I do feel like because the ACLU has more lawyers than other civil rights groups and can go into court repeatedly, that's a, you know, a great thing for us. And so that's the Muslim ban. I want to talk now a little about the separation of children at the border and give you a sense of where things are. And, you know, as I said in that video, or I think I said in that video, it's the worst thing I've seen in 25 plus years of doing this civil rights work. I mean, just the absolute most brutal, horrible level. And so what happened with the family separation case, we in the fall of 2017 began hearing that the administration was taking children away. Then you saw in that video clip the former chief of staff saying, no, I think he was maybe a DHS head then, saying, no, we're thinking about it, but we haven't done it. So people sort of relaxed, but we began hearing more and more that family separation was occurring. And I went out to San Diego and to visit this Congolese woman who was in detention, had been there 3 months without a lawyer. And she told me her story, how she had fled the Congo fearing for her life with her then 6-year-old daughter. They had traveled for months, and some of you may have read the article on the cover of the New York Times magazine about the ACLU that has her and her daughter on the cover. Talks a little about it. A grueling 3-month journey. And they finally got to the US. I mean, they were walking barefoot, begging for food, finally got to the US and approached the port of entry, so legally, didn't sneak into the country, you know, despite the narrative from the administration that we only take children away if you sneak in illegally, as if that would be okay. But she sought asylum. They said, okay, you can apply for asylum. They brought her into the US with her daughter. They put her in a makeshift detention facility for 4 days. Then they asked her to come down to the office. They brought her down to the office. They separated her and her child into different offices. They handcuffed her and said, you're going to be in a detention facility in San Diego for adults. And at that moment, she describes hearing her 6-year-old screaming, Mommy, don't let them take me away, don't let them take me away. They took the daughter to Chicago. They didn't tell the mother what had happened for 4 days. They finally told her the daughter was in Chicago, which of course meant nothing to her. Might as well have told her she's on the moon, coming from a little village in the Congo. And she had been able to speak to her daughter about every 10 days briefly on the phone, had no idea why they took the child away. She was in a detention facility where she couldn't speak to anybody because her primary language was Lingala. And when I got out there, she was gaunt, had lost an enormous amount of weight, wasn't sleeping, had just had no idea what was happening. In the meantime, the daughter had turned 7, celebrated her birthday all by herself in Chicago. We went to court. We originally thought we're going to wait till we have the whole case put together and file a national class action on behalf of the hundreds of people we were hearing had been separated at that point. But I decided it was too urgent for this woman. So we went to court first just on behalf of this woman. The government said, well, she didn't have all her papers with her. Well, of course, after 4 months of traveling, she didn't have anything at that point. They said she could have been a trafficker. She looked identical to the child, but also the child had been screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, don't let them take me away," which would have not been happening with a trafficker. But in any event, the judge just cut through it and said, well, have you done a DNA test? You haven't even told this woman why you took the child away. It had been 4 months. The government said no. The judge said, well, let's do it, and let's do it immediately. They did the DNA test. Of course, it was the mother. She fortunately has been reunited with her daughter, and I would say that I was there when they were reunited in Chicago. It was maybe the most emotional scene I've ever witnessed in the 25 plus years. And it wasn't just that they had been separated for 4 months in a strange country. I think that they both thought we're probably never going to see each other again. I mean, there was no reason to believe they would. So we filed this national class action, and the government revealed that there were 2,800 families that they had separated. The judge said this is brutal and offensive. This is a judge who was appointed by George Bush. This is San Diego, and he said, I want this to stop, and I want these families reunited. We then had to ensure the reunification, but because already close to 500 parents have been deported without their children, we had to then search for the parents all over the world. I went to Guatemala searching for parents. We finally have given them all the opportunity to reunite. And almost everyone has taken that opportunity. The reason some haven't is because the parents who were deported without their children feel it's just too dangerous for the child to come back. And the unfortunate thing is that you hear people saying, oh, see, the parents didn't even want their kids. And, I think everyone in this room knows that couldn't possibly be true. When I was in Guatemala talking to a father who was in his 40s, he said, look, my life is over. And that's sad enough to hear, that a man in his 40s saying, my life's over, the gangs control my neighborhood. The other day they slipped a phone under my door. I knew I had to answer it. They said to me, we know where your children are. We know the routes they take to school. We know the route you take to work. You'll pay this much money every week, or one of them will die. He said, I just can't bring my child back here. So some of the parents now are going to be permanently separated because it's too dangerous for the child to come back because they're gang recruitment age. And so that we are trying to get the parents the opportunity to come back to the U.S. What's really unfortunate, I think most people in the public don't know, is that the practice was worse in the past than we had realized and is still ongoing. What happened last year is that an internal watchdog report from the government revealed that there may have been thousands more separated even before those 2,800. We went back immediately to court and said, Your Honor, we need to know who these families are. The government said, well, they were separated before the case. We don't have to tell you. The judge said, no, absolutely not. You better tell us. You need to tell the ACLU. We're in this country, we're not going to have an historical record of who these families are separated, and we're going to find them. And again, the government said, well, we need 2 years to provide the ACLU with a list of the families. Not to find the families, just to provide the ACLU with a list. And the judge said, why do you need 2 years? And they said, Your Honor, candidly, we didn't keep track of the families. The judge said, you give the ACLU the names on a rolling basis, and you do it finally within 6 months, which is October 25th in 6 days, 6 months runs. We've already got 1,500 more names. The government says there could be up to another 1,000 or so. So now we're talking about 2,500 to 3,000 on top of the 2,800. So everyone thought 2,800, that's unbelievable, but now we're talking far more. The other thing that's happened is we've just learned that the government has separated another 1,000 children just since the court told them to stop it. And the government has come in and said, well, Your Honor, you told us we couldn't have a broad policy of automatically separating, but you did say we could separate if in an individual case we determined the parent was neglectful or a danger to their child based on, for example, criminal history. So what we expected to find is that there were 1,000 parents who had convictions for child abuse, or the guard had seen the parent beating the child in front of them. Turns out that they've been separating for thefts of $500 committed 27 years ago, a disorderly conduct from 10 years ago, a DUI offense from 12 years ago, on and on and on. Or they've said the parents seem neglectful. In one case, and we provided an affidavit to the judge, they separated a parent, a father, because they felt he should have been changing the diaper quicker. The child, as the government knew, had been sick with 104 fever. The father was doing everything he could to deal with the illness of the child in a detention center. The child finally fell asleep, but had a wet diaper. As a parent, I would have let the child sleep because that was far more important. Child experts have said, of course you let the child sleep. You need to deal with that first. The government said, and these are not child welfare experts from the government, these are just guards, said, no, he should have woken the child up to change the diaper. They took the child away. I mean, that's the kind of brutality. So that's another 1,000 on top of 5,000 to 6,000. So we're talking about 7,000, and we're not talking about teenagers. There are some teenagers, but there are also kids. I mean, the youngest is 5 months. Kids under a year, I mean, just horrendous. Kids begging, please don't take me away, please don't take me away, and the parents have to stand there hopelessly. And, you know, the numbers tell one story, but ultimately I think it's the little human tragedies, every little kid. And, you know, some of them just stick with me. I don't even know that they're the most brutal cases, but they just sort of stick with you. One 4-year-old from Honduras needed glasses. So his parents, modest means, were able to get him glasses in Honduras, but they also got him a glasses case, which was essential because they knew they couldn't afford another pair of glasses if it broke. When they came to take him away, he fortunately was wearing his glasses, and he was begging, please don't take me away from my mommy, please don't take me away. They took him away. The mother wanted to get the glasses case. No, they didn't let her get the glasses case. So all day long, all the mother thinks about is my little boy have his glasses? Are they broken? Can he see? Will they get him another pair of glasses? Another father with a 7-year-old boy said, I know you're going to take him away. Please, just please let me tell the boy first, and so I can try as best I can to explain it to him. Just give me a few minutes. No, they just scream out, you're coming here, you're coming there. Not even giving, just one little event after another. And it's not, the children are so permanently traumatized. When I visited one of the mothers early in the case who had finally got her 4-year-old back, she told me the 4-year-old just keeps asking, are they going to come and take me away again in the middle of the night? That kind of deep-seated trauma and vulnerability has set in with these children. And it's also the parents who are feeling traumatized, because they are feeling so guilty. The children are coming back and are so angry and resentful at their parents. They're too young to understand their parents couldn't do anything. So they say to their parents, didn't you love me enough to keep me? Why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you fight the guards? And it's just, they are racked with guilt. And so they all need trauma help. We have now filed a damages action against individuals in the White House all the way down, saying they should be made to pay money, but we also want the judge to create a medical fund to use for trauma help for these children. And so we're still fighting. Everyone thinks the family separation crisis is over. It's not, unfortunately. It's still ongoing, and we are going to be still looking for the families who were separated in the past. The government has given us vague addresses, stale phone numbers, so we have a team at a law firm and other NGO partners that are making thousands of calls, thousands. But ultimately, the numbers are probably stale at this point because these are the separations from the past. So we're going to be back in Central America on foot looking for all these parents. Hopefully, many of them found a way to get their children back through self-help, but many will not have. And so, the government is not doing anything. And I finally just stood up in court and said, Your Honor, we will do it. The ACLU will do it. We will find the resources around the country. There are people who want to help. There are law firms that want to help. There are NGOs. We will track all the families down. And so that's what's going on. And it's been an enormous task, but we have said publicly we will not stop till we find every family. We had thought we had found every family of the 2,800, but now, we're looking at 6,000 or 7,000, and it could continue. That's the family separation saga. And I wish that was the only thing that was going on. I mean, even if that's all I were working on with our whole national team, it would be a 24/7 project. But unfortunately, as you all know, every week the president is doing something in the immigration area, and each thing is an attempt to fundamentally alter our immigration system. In any other year, each of the cases we're working on would be this biggest and maybe the sole thing we focused on because it's such a fundamental change. So for example, at the border, which it's the president's go-to to rally his base, effectively, and I'm not sure this is getting through in the media, effectively he has ended asylum. And it's impossible to overstate the importance of that. I mean, this is an historic moment in the U.S. After World War II, when the United States sent back to St. Louis with Jewish people, most of whom were killed, and other refugees were fleeing, the United States and the rest of the world said never again. Since then, we've had an asylum system that doesn't grant everyone asylum, but it at least gives you a hearing, the opportunity. The president has effectively ended that. He has said, and there's a number of policies, and we're fighting all of them in court. One of them, though, that I think will ultimately have the most serious effect, and as I said, I think effectively end asylum, is that if you now transit through a third country on the way to the U.S., to the U.S.-Mexico border, you're automatically denied asylum. What that means is everyone's automatically denied asylum because a handful of people have the money and connections to fly directly, so they're not subject to the ban. But everyone else has to go through either Guatemala or Mexico. And it's aimed, obviously, at Central Americans. And so they have no choice but to go through. And we got a national injunction on that. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, in a temporary ruling, has allowed the ban to go into effect, this transit rule to go into effect. And so we're still fighting, and I'll be in court in 10 days on that again. We'll have to see what happens. But everyone comes through another country. And so if everyone who comes through another country can't get asylum, there's essentially no more asylum. Now, and one of the challenges for us is not just the legal arguments in court, but to combat the narrative. Because the administration obviously has the bigger bully pulpit, and they are trying to make all their policies seem reasonable, and I think a lot of people feel like what they're saying does seem reasonable. And our challenge, which is a difficult challenge, is to get the facts out there to show that what they're saying doesn't jive with the reality on the ground. So for example, with the transit rule, they say, well, why should the U.S. carry 100% of the burden to provide asylum? Why shouldn't other countries share the burden? And they point to how we have an agreement with Canada, that Canada shares the asylum burden. But the government knows full well that the Canada analogy is not apt, right? Canada has a fully functioning asylum system, some say better than ours, And obviously, it's more than safe to wait in Toronto for your asylum hearing. But what's happened is the administration says, well, so Mexico and Guatemala should do the same thing. But the administration knows full well, and every single expert prior to this administration, Republican or Democrat, will tell you that Mexico and Guatemala do not have fully functioning asylum systems. Guatemala has 4 asylum officers, and now they want to send thousands of people. But on top of that, those countries are so dangerous that no one could possibly wait around to apply for asylum in those countries, because the administration is saying you not only have to apply, but you have to wait for a decision. It could take years, and the families are literally sitting ducks. So this idea that, oh, Mexico and Guatemala will just share the burden, and the administration says, well, if you're really in danger, you'll apply for asylum the first country you get to. Well, that's absolutely wrong. You would never, because the gangs can cross into Mexico. They're multinational gangs. You're just a sitting duck. So the other policy the administration has enacted is called Remain in Mexico, and these are both ACLU challenges, which says, okay, for some people we'll allow you to apply for asylum, but you need to wait in Mexico and then come back to the US when your hearing number comes up. When we visit these families, they are packed into shelters, if they can even find shelters, like 40 people in a room with little kids. They cannot leave the shelter because the cartels just prey on them. In one town, 50% of the migrants who have left the shelter have been kidnapped. They're sex trafficked. They are literally sitting ducks there, and it's families with little children. The administration started by saying, well, we won't make anybody wait. We won't make anybody wait in Mexico if they're pregnant, if they're ill, or they're a family with a child. That lasted a few weeks. Now there are 50,000 people who have been sent to Mexico to wait for their asylum hearings. Almost, it's hard. I don't know the statistic, and I don't think we have yet been able to come up with the statistic, but most of them are families with little children, and they are just have no way to protect themselves in Mexico. Mexico has said to the administration, we can't protect these families from the gangs. So they just sit and never leave the shelters and hope that they'll be able to wait it out. But the administration knows that most of them will not be able to last and will give up their asylum claims. And at the end of the day, there's really no way to look at what the administration's doing other than to say they're trying to end asylum for Central Americans. You know, there's just, because nobody could reasonably think this was a way to provide a fair asylum hearing. You know, and we are, sometimes people say to us, well, do you think all these people are entitled to asylum? No, that's not the ACLU's position. We don't advocate open borders. What we are saying, though, is there has to be a process. There has to be a hearing like there always has been, and the administration is not doing that, and there's real hostility. But it's not just at the border, it's even in the interior. Now they've enacted a new policy that says you don't get a full hearing if you haven't been here 2 years and you live anywhere in the country. So that means they can pick someone up in Nashville or Chicago or St. Louis and say, we think you're here illegally and you haven't been here 2 years, and an immigration officer can just deport you without any hearing. Just completely inconsistent with fundamental due process. They are also about to enact a housing regulation that says you cannot get federal housing if any member of your family is undocumented, or that undocumented person will have to leave the household. They know it means the whole family will have to leave. Every prior administration, Democrat or Republican, had a simple solution. They prorated. You only got as much money as if you were here illegally, but the family could stay together. Now the undocumented person can't live there, so it means all the families will have to leave. It's just one sort of cruel thing after another. They're only taking wealthy immigrants now because they have what's called the public charge. And so now all of a sudden, all the immigrants who came and were vital to this country's success would not be able to come. Only wealthy people, highly educated people, right? And there seems to be some sense of everyone's grandparents came here speaking perfect English and highly educated, right? I mean, my grandmother, till she was 17, called me the boy, and my father would say, Mom, we've named him already, you know. She worked in a factory, she got here, she didn't speak any English, you know, she was poor, and then my father did better, you know, and it's the immigrant way of life here. And it says everything. It's a whitening of who we're gonna take, and to only be wealthy and educated. So there's just a brutal, it's become very brutal, and it's week after week. And I think it's not just the people who are getting deported, it's the toxic stress on the communities, constantly fearing that they're going to be taken away, that when their child comes home from school, he's not going to see his mother or father there. And I think that's going on throughout all the communities. So is that a good place to stop? Okay. Well, I thought, oh, thank you. I thought maybe we could just, yeah.
Take this all in, and it's more than just your legal acumen. So it's really important for us to know that you do that.
Thank you, Hetty.
Let's go with questions. We have mics that Helena, and I think Claire will pass around.
Here. It's me.
So just raise your hand and someone will Sarah.
Thank you so much for speaking. I really enjoyed the point about how we have the courts there to be a line of defense about injustices. Right now, when I hear the courts are a line of defense, I immediately get kind of scared, because if it escalates to the Supreme Court, I don't feel that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I want to make 2 points. One is a clarifying point, because I don't want to overstate that the courts can be ultimately the only route we go. The courts are going to play a role, an important role, but they can't be the only thing, and in some ways, maybe not the most important thing. It's the public outcry that I think is absolutely critical. With family separation, we were able to get the stories of the children out, because ultimately me talking about the Constitution or legal rules, you know, on MSNBC or CNN, people and just flip the channel, right? But if I can talk about the children or get the children's voices on, you know, in audio, that's much more critical. So we had this enormous public outcry over family separation 2 summers ago, and it transcended liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, because people said, look, in the United States, we can have disagreements about macro immigration policy, but we can't take children away. So Laura Bush wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, enough's enough. The Pope came out. Conservative religious leaders came out. This enormous public outcry, and then the president backed down. And that was the first time the president ever backed down on domestic policy. So ultimately, I think it is the public outcry that's critical, and there's so much noise out there. The job, I think the real challenge for us and you in the audience, to be talking to your friend, saying this is what's going on. We need that outrage, because it's very easy to sort of get desensitized, and the outrage meter is sort of, because it's so much, it's hard to get outraged all the time and to figure out, but that really is the challenge. But on your specific point, I think that this is a tricky situation just on the legal front, because we have won a couple of huge cases in the lower federal courts, stopping this asylum transit rule. Then the Supreme Court stepped in and allowed them to do it temporarily until we can get it back to the Supreme Court. We got an injunction on using the money to build the wall. The Supreme Court stepped in and allowed it. And so I think you're right to point that out. That's, you know, going to be a tricky strategic decision for us constantly. You know, how do we keep cases, which cases go to the Supreme Court, which don't? How do we maneuver? Because we can't always count on the Supreme Court to rule for us. I am not one of those people that thinks we're never going to win in the Supreme Court. You know, some people say that. I think the court will take each case on its own, and that we will win some cases, but, you know, I would never tell you it's going to be easy. We won a very big case in the Ninth Circuit, and what it said was asylum seekers at the border can't be deported based on truncated hearings. They have to have their day in a real court, in a federal court. The government just asked the Supreme Court to review that case on the merits, and yesterday the Supreme Court agreed, so that case will be coming up. That's an ACLU case. So I think you're right to ask about that. I think it's going to be a constant strategic focus for us about which cases should end up in the Supreme Court, which shouldn't. But the government has made no secret of they're going to bring everything to the Supreme Court and take their shot there. So you're absolutely right to ask about it. I don't have any easy answers other than, we're going to keep fighting. But the courts, even in the best of times, the courts can't be 100% panacea. So we really, really need the public outrage. It cannot become the new normal that we deny asylum in the United States, or that we take children away, or that we indefinitely detain children. It just can't be. And it's very hard to get that emotional outrage going on. I mean, if you just watch the news on the impeachment inquiry, it would take up your whole day, right? But then there's the impeachment inquiry, there's immigration, there's every other civil liberties issue, there's racial justice, there's everything, the criminal justice system, there's everything going on. So I think the PR battle is as difficult as I've ever seen in the 25 plus years.
Hi, I'm over here.
Oh, sorry.
That's fine. I had a question. I'm hoping you could speak to the termination of TPS, particularly.
Right.
I know that there was a case of 4 countries, I think, together, and then Honduras and maybe Nepal. And I know there have been some stays.
Right.
I'm specifically curious about Honduras. I have a good friend from there who's told that she has to leave in, I guess, January 5th of 2020. And I didn't know if there had been a stay for that country.
Yeah, so I mean, that's going to get really in the weeds about where all the different court cases are. Maybe we could talk after. But I think TPS is another one of those situations where if we prevail in the lower courts, they will take it to the Supreme Court. I think everyone knows that it's going to be a tough legal fight, and that's another case where sort of outrage about sending people back to countries that can't absorb them again is going to be critical. TPS, just for those of you who don't know, is temporary protected status. We allow people to stay here when something's happened in their country, and we generally don't end that temporary protected status until we're sure that that country can take them back. And so the president has just gone down the line and ended temporary protected status for one country after another, and he's called them shithole countries, and we got to send people back. There's multiple court cases going on and multiple dates, so maybe is that all right to just talk after about the specifics of where Honduras is?
And I should have started out by saying thank you so much. Like, I really cannot tell you how thankful I am for you being here today.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, and I'll start with that same thing. Thank you very much for
Thanks.
not just for being here today, but for everything you've done, for the years that you've done it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. I have 2 questions. The last thing you said made my mind switch back to Alabama a few weeks ago, and all of the, 800 people that were rounded up by ICE, and what happened to their children afterwards.
Right.
Where was ACLU involved in that?
I think that's one of those places where, and I don't know the details of but that is one of those places where, when I talked about in the beginning, that the structure of the ACLU has been critical, because there's just so much going on. That would not probably be a situation where I could get down to Alabama immediately, but having our Alabama affiliate there, I suspect, and I think whether you're talking about Mississippi or Alabama, I don't know, the Alabama one? Yeah,
I'm
okay,
pretty sure it was Alabama.
Yeah, recent Alabama.
The poultry
Right.
processing food plants.
Right. And so that's one of those situations. I mentioned Mississippi only because the same thing happened in Mississippi. And so that's one of those things where I'm sure our affiliate is dealing with it, and if it becomes a court case, then I will we'll be getting involved, but on the ground. And so I can talk to you after, and I can get you information later. I'm not sure what's precisely happened with our affiliate, but one of the horrible things, I'm glad you brought that up, because there are some things that are just hard to challenge. Maybe taking the children away, those types of things, and maybe if they didn't have a warrant, all those types of things. But there are people who are here without status, and in the past, administrations, both Democratic and Republican, would exercise some type of discretion well, you've been here, you have no crime, you've been working for a long time, you're raising children, you're US citizens, and it's just, you don't just round them up. And so whether things like that will be vulnerable to a legal challenge by the ACLU, I think remains to be seen, and it may vary from place to place, but I'm sure our affiliate must be on the ground trying to help in very practical ways, monitor, and also figure out, were there violations? Did they just bust in without a warrant? Did they do something wrong in taking the children? Those types of things.
Yeah, I'm sure they did it all right, unfortunately. I called the attorney that was on the news and talked to her that night when it broke, and because she had and she was surprised that I managed to get her phone number, and she ended up giving me her cell number.
And she was an ACLU attorney?
No.
Oh, no, right, okay, that's why you were asking.
I'm trying to remember if what kind, I don't know, I don't remember, but she was on the news talking about the children.
Right.
And that children were going home today to no families because they were all rounded up. And so I just asked her my second question to you, which is, what can I do? I'm Joe Nobody. What can I do?
Yeah, so let me just say one thing. If you want, through Hetty, I can get you in touch with the ACLU of Alabama, and that, maybe they're more used to sort of trying to, I don't know who the attorney was you saw, and maybe she's not used to sort of putting the public in the mix. But I think you're hitting on two things that are important. One is that separations of families occur in a variety of ways. So the case I was talking about is they just are taking them away for no real reason. In this situation, the children are being brutalized, but they're claiming the parent has to be deported, so inevitably the child is going to get separated. And the truth is, I just want to make this point quickly and then answer your specific question, is separations are going on throughout the United States and have been going on in a brutal way, and so African Americans rightly say, let's remember, and Native Americans, that this was always something that happened. And even in the criminal justice system, the constant prosecution of people with low-level offenses who have children results in separations every day. To your specific question, I have two things to say. One is to say the ACLU, I don't think, is doing a good enough job of figuring out how to use people like you who want to help, because you don't have to be a lawyer to help. There's an enormous amount you can do, and I think we've gotten overwhelmed, which is the silver lining, I think, of people saying, we want to do something. We don't just want to be mad in front of our television. And I think we need to do a better job about that. What I would say is that public outcry is critical, protest, signing petitions is critical, obviously some kind of contribution. But more than that, and I think you're asking about this, is sort of what can I do as a practical matter, right? And that's something where I think we need to figure out better networks, because it could be everything from, do I say I'm gonna help the children deal in school? Do I, try and get them some kind of backpack? Do I organize my community to say, these children are now back with their parents and they're going to try and go to school, but they're the only kids in their class who don't have a backpack? So I think, and I think that's going to have to happen at the local level. So one thing, again, we can, through Hetty, get you in touch with people here on the ground who can try and deal with that. If you're a social worker, there's an enormous need for trauma help. But I just think there's a lot of practical things. If people speak Spanish, there's a need for translation. There's always a need for people at the border. That's a big ask for people to take a few days and go to the border, but there's always a need for it. But I do think that we need to do a better job of figuring out easy ways for people to get involved. And I think we've just gotten overwhelmed, and we're so up to our neck in, we have to fight this battle, and then we don't have to, because figuring out networks of how to incorporate people is hard, but it's critically important. I think that we need to sort of spend more time. So I would just say, I think the ACLU needs to, and other groups need to figure out, but there are groups doing it, and so I do want, to the extent you want to do it, I want to connect you locally here.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking and being here. I was wondering, based on your experience in the past 3 years with this administration and all of the cases and issues you've worked on, climate crisis, environmental issues, are these overlapping issues? Do you see them working in, or your experience, if you could speak?
Right, so that's an interesting question. The ACLU does not do straight environmental work, but one of the places I think we're really going to see this overlap, and maybe this is what you're getting at, or to some extent, is there are a lot of people who are now in need of leaving their country because of climate change. That climate change has just made it impossible to grow crops, to do other things, there are floods, and they just need to leave. Our law at this point, at least for asylum, is not really recognizing that as a basis. I think that's one of those issues going forward, especially for young people, to really think about how is our immigration system going to deal with people who need help because of climate change. It's just going to become a bigger and bigger issue. Right now, I don't think the law has figured out how to incorporate it. And frankly, right now, it's hard to think about, at least until the next election, hopefully, it's hard to think about how to improve our system as opposed to just not letting it get worse and worse and worse. But I think you're right to ask that question. There's going to be enormous overlap, I think, between environmental issues and, there's already sort of issues around environmental impact on communities of color and poor countries, and I think that's another place. But in immigration, I do think that's one of the big issues that we're going to be confronting soon.
So coming back to your discussion of what we can do to help. So I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University, and about a year ago we received a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We're specifically studying the health and well-being of young children. One of our groups is children of immigrants, and we did this in part because of what we were seeing, I'd seen in my past research in Texas as well, is the effect on families, the chilling effect of these policies.
Right.
And of course we had HB 2315 here in Tennessee, which came into being, and then there's a public charge rule, which you mentioned.
Right.
And so we're in the field right now collecting data. So we're also getting data from the state health and education agencies, linking that. We're collecting this data. So I just had 3 interviews this week, for example, with federally qualified health centers, county health departments, people there, and they're all documenting and telling us about the cases in which families have stopped coming in or are fearful of coming in to get health care. And so we're also now able to take this and look at this in the data on children. So my thought is how can we as researchers, is this kind of information useful? Because I put in the public comment on the public charge rule, of course it's going through, but I know there were court cases this week. Right. So as I'm hearing this and we're documenting this, can you use this information?
Well, thank you for doing that, and I think for sure that kind of research is critical to whether it's to be used in court cases or just for public consumption. The people need to understand that immigrant families are not coming in for services because they're too scared, because I think that chilling effect is very real around the country. So it's both causing trauma, toxic stress, but also in very practical ways keeping them from getting the benefits that they are entitled to even, and so I think we should, we can hopefully talk and reach out because I think all that research is critical. We need to do a better job of incorporating all that kind of social science data into the public narrative.
Let's take 2 more questions, one there and then one here, and then we'll have some time to just visit.
I was just wondering what the status is now of the deferred action for the children who are in hospitals, where the president said we're eliminating that status.
So, they've backed down on that, which was another place where public outcry, I think even the Republicans said, what in the world, So hopefully that's going to be okay. We'll see. There's a lot of flip-flopping that goes on, but hopefully.
Thank you so much for sharing stories that I think too often we don't get to hear about in the media, and that's actually the point of my question. I think we all have family members or people in our communities that have differing points of view. I think if any of those people were here today hearing these stories, that their minds may have changed a little bit. Around the dinner tables when I'm having discussions, I think a lot of the arguments get framed about the details of what we're doing, what's the purpose of it, and kind of these meta level conversations. But is there a way that we could have access or be able to share these stories on such a personal level, again, to be able to...
That's a good question, because I think, your primary point is, which I think is your primary point, is right, that ultimately the only thing that cuts through is hitting people at a visceral level. That there's just, you can sort of argue with people till they're blue in the face about the Constitution should mean this, or macro immigration policy should be this, or exactly what the economic effect of immigrants are in particular areas of the country. But it's hard for people to turn their back on a 1-month-old, 5-month-old, a year-old. And so getting these stories out has been something that we have wanted to do and tried to do. But your point is an interesting one about, is it not just us who need to, but do we need to have a place where people can hear these stories and then retell them? I need to think more about that. Part of it is that if you hear someone tell the story, you can retell it. I realize that doesn't always, I think I'm gonna need to think about it, but your point about you all, in order to convince people, need these stories is important. And if, to the extent you all can actually meet immigrant families and see it for yourself, or someone who's not so hardened in their position is willing to come with you to meet the immigrant families, I think that's important, because it's, what I am very worried about is that the human dimension of all this gets lost in aggregate statistics and abstract policy arguments. In this notion that, all these families are gang members, and if you actually meet with the family and you see, I just end on this. We could maybe talk after, but I think you're right that we need to do a better job of getting sort of almost like a data bank of here are the affidavits we've submitted in all these cases that have details about the families. One of the cruelest things is that when you go to the Northern Triangle and see how horrible the gangs are and how much they control things and how hard it is to stand up, well, a lot of mothers have stood up and said, "You're not taking my kid, and we're going to flee," because they know if they stay, they're going to kill the kid or kill the mother. It's just, that's the way it works. And they get to the U.S. and they think, well, the President of the United States hates these gangs. He's going to be proud of us for standing up. And then they get here and they say, no, you can't have asylum. And I didn't mention this, but unbelievably, they have now, this administration has enacted a new rule saying if all you're fleeing is gang violence, that's no longer a basis for asylum. The ACLU has got that blocked in court, but the government has appealed. But it's just so disheartening for these families to have stood up, risked their life, and get here, and then hear the president say it after the day before going on a rant about how everyone's a gang member. But we need to do a better job of incorporating people who want to help and getting these stories out. So I need to think about both those, and I'm glad you asked those questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Lee, I hope you will come back, because not only do you maybe get into the courtroom here, but just to keep us inspired and remind us that there is hope and there is work we all need to do. I'm going to bring it. So one, thank you. And two, just before we close, need to bring it back to Tennessee. We're a battleground state in terms of what's happening in this state as it relates to the assault, the attacks on immigrants and refugees. The Vanderbilt professor referenced HB 2315, which ACLU, with our partners, Turk and Conexión, worked really hard to defeat at the legislature unsuccessfully. We've tried to be strategic about how to pursue this case in court. As Lee pointed out, you can't always do that as easily. It's a new law that basically prohibits cities from wanting to create sanctuary cities or ensuring that their law enforcement do not work with ICE. There is a lawsuit that just will hopefully get shut down, but it's where the Tennessee legislature actually passed a law saying that they wanted to shut down refugee resettlement in this state. And again, all of our partners came together to fight it, and we're hoping that that will go by the wayside. But we just learned that a few days ago that the state is planning to take it up to the state Supreme Court, or the U.S. Supreme Court. That's because they have a law firm, the Moore Law Center out of D.C., who is supporting the case when the Tennessee Attorney General chose not to defend the law. And we certainly know that there are sheriffs across this state, including in this city, that have agreements with ICE so that they can keep individuals, undocumented folks, locked up in jail, allowing the federal government to pay them, but to use their space to treat people in a way that challenges due process and dignity. So I urge you, based on what you're hearing, what you heard from Lee, what you know is happening in this state, to get on the front line. Some of you are in the courtroom, but most importantly, we need to be not only on the streets, but inside the building, talking with legislators. There are and were some elected officials, council people here who are supportive of wanting to partner with all of us to make sure that our city, our state, is a safe place for all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, economic status, gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. So I urge you to leave here using your voices, deciding to break, as you talked about, with family members. Talk to folks in the rural communities. We have 95 counties. We're nonpartisan, but the 5 blue counties are pretty good on this issue. It's getting out into the rural communities. So go there, go to the courthouse square, find the favorite diner and sit there and talk, or put out a book that might tell a story, or the New York Times magazine that has this beautiful picture of the Congolese, the woman from the Congo who saw her child separated and ripped apart. Vote, get people to vote. ACLU's mantra now is vote like your rights depend on it. They do. Thank you for being here. I hope you will come back. I hope we will partner with ACLU and all of our partners. The Conexión folks are here. They're some of our best partners with Turk. So talk with people, get to know each other, and know that we're all in this together. Thank you.